This is Think It Through with me, April A. Bear. Get ready to start thinking. I know, it's hard, and you'd probably rather not. But here we go anyway. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Think It Through. I've got a topic today that's both dear to my heart and has relevance to critical thinking. I'll be talking about Star Trek. Now you might have some questions about this topic, the first being, why is Star Trek so dear to my heart? And second, what is the connection between Star Trek and critical thinking? Well, the answer to the first question, besides the fact that I've been a major Trek nerd for my entire life, is that I had a previous career as an actor, and I had the unique privilege to be one of the character actors of Star Trek The Experience during its run at the Las Vegas Hilton from 1998 until 2008. I was there the entire time, and I'd like to describe it as the best job in the galaxy. And I met my guest today, John Champion, at one of the yearly Star Trek conventions that were held there, and we've been friends ever since. He's one of the hosts of the very popular Mission Log podcast, and you'll be listening to the interview I recently did with him, in which we talk about our connection to Star Trek and to each other. And we discuss some of the lessons that Trek can teach us about critical thinking. But before we delve into that, I'm going to give you a very short Communication 101 lecture about rhetoric. When most of us hear the word rhetoric, we tend to think of it in phrases like political rhetoric or empty rhetoric. We equate it with things like insincerity, exaggeration, and manipulation. We hardly ever consider that Aristotle wasn't necessarily talking about that definition of rhetoric when he penned his treatise called The Rhetoric, well over 2 millennia ago. Rhetoric, simply put, is the art of persuasion. The things a speaker has to do effectively in order to move their audience to think, believe, or even do something. When you consider rhetoric in those terms, you begin to see that it's not just a negative thing. It could be used by a highly ethical person who wants to move people to do something that will be of benefit. Or it could be used by a demagogue who wants to undermine institutions in order to gain power. Aristotle explained that there are 3 ways by which people are persuaded. These are known as the 3 proofs, or 3 appeals that speakers use, and you might have heard of them. Ethos, logos, and pathos. Ethos, the appeal to authority, means that in order to be persuasive, the speaker has to epitomize certain qualities that we associate with authority. I call them the 4 C's: credibility, character, competence, and charisma. So, credibility, how trustworthy is this speaker? Character, does this person seem responsible? Competence, does this person appear to know what they're talking about? And charisma, is there something compelling about this person that makes you want to listen? The more of these qualities an audience sees in a speaker, the more likely they may be to believe whatever that person is telling them. The second proof is logos, appeal to logic and reason. This is where proof or evidence comes in, like facts and statistics, and the speaker uses reasoning processes like inductive, deductive, analogical, and causal reasoning to link the evidence back to their claim. Logos is the basis of argument, and any truly good argument will have logic and reasoning at its core. Finally, there's pathos, the appeal to emotion. The persuader uses pathos when they attempt to appeal to the emotions of the listener. The speaker could use things like stories or metaphor, anecdotes, and passionate or emotional language to engender particular emotions in the audience, and then connects those feelings to the thing that they're trying to convince the audience to believe. Feelings can be powerful persuaders. You notice I haven't mentioned Star Trek at all yet. Well, let me give you a little hint about how it's connected to Aristotle. Kirk, Spock, McCoy. Ethos, logos, pathos. You get it? Maybe I need to bring in my good friend John Champion, host of Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast, to dig a little deeper into this connection. And here we go. So, John Champion, welcome to Think It Through. I have to tell you how excited and honored I am to have you as a guest and on my show.
That is a two-way street because I really enjoy your show.
Oh my gosh.
And you're somebody whose talents I have admired for a long time. And I was so happy and excited when you started your show. And in short order, here I am. So this is great.
Hey, I've been waiting for a reason to ask you, but this is the perfect reason. So
sweet.
So you know that, of course, that I love Trek, and I really have never asked you where your love of Star Trek came from.
I've tried to figure that out, and I think if I think back to when I was really young, I can't remember a time that Star Trek wasn't around in some way or another. And I grew up at that time when it was the 70s revival, when the animated series, the toys, all of this stuff was coming out, and the pre-Star Wars. So this is kind of a sweet spot for discovering science fiction at that time. And I know that my mom liked it, but somehow it just really took hold of me. And I remember having the toys, remember dressing up as Kirk or Spock, given the option, Halloween or whatever. And I remember being really excited when Star Trek The Motion Picture came out in 79, because here were our heroes returning in an epic way. But all that said, I was a fan of kind of pop culture and sci-fi anyway. So when Star Trek was hot, really into Star Trek. When Star Wars came out, of course I was into Star Wars, because how could you not be, But Star Trek just always stuck with me. And there was a little bit of time, like when I went to college and I just wasn't watching as much TV, that it kind of got away from me. And then I rediscovered it, and I went to the convention for the first time in years and sort of thought, oh, wait, these are my people. Why have I not been here in so long? So, because I think my first my first sci-fi convention was when I was about 14, and I would just go to anything that I could in the South where I grew up. I grew up in Birmingham, and there were a few there, but the really big ones, the good ones, were in Atlanta or right outside. And I would just go whenever I could and had a blast.
So this love, that has been building up your whole life, and then you end up with like the coolest gig on the planet.
Short of being on Star Trek, right?
Short of being actually in Star Trek.
Because I always say that you had the coolest gig on the planet.
Oh, of course. And
you got to live Star Trek for a decade.
Yes, I did. That was something that is so dear to my heart. I can't even tell you, and at least once a day, I reminisce about something that happened there.
Of course. Yeah, it was a weird kind of journey, because the fandom has always been there in my life to one degree or another. Even if I wasn't watching the shows actively, I look around my office at home right now, and there's a starship up there, and there's a phaser up there, and there's the stuff has just always been around me.
Right.
And when I was living in Chicago, I was self-producing a show there, a TV/internet show/podcast. It took many permutations. And as my business partner and I grew that, it reconnected us both to different kinds of fandom. Right. And mine happened to be Star Trek. We had other people that worked with us who were really into comic books, or really into anime, or really, whatever it was. And that led me to partner with a lot of people who are also working in Star Trek fandom. So Creation Entertainment, Star Trek The Experience, all these other places. I ended up shooting archival video and interviews and producing little promotional packages and all this stuff. And eventually that landed me with Rod Roddenberry, Gene Roddenberry's son. And we kind of hit it off. We're around the same age. We have a similar kind of points of view on any number of topics. And we stayed in touch. He lived in LA at the time. I lived in Chicago at the time. And we just stayed in touch. And I would do the odd kind of like video editing gig for him. And at a certain point, I said, hey, I think I'm moving to LA. Just sort of the winds have blown that way. And if I do, is there work? Is there more of this? And you fast forward a little bit, and as I'm still doing these small jobs, he was finishing up Trek Nation, his documentary about his father. And he said, now the next step is to look at Star Trek itself, but in a big way. And episode by episode, how do we examine, analyze, discuss, share that with the world? And he and I were coming from a similar position, which is we both knew a lot about Star Trek, but we hadn't really done a methodical watch through of everything. And I think he already had in mind that a podcast is the way to go. But we had talked about like, okay, is it a blog? Is it a documentary? What is it? And podcasts seemed to be the way to go. And he really put it together. He said, here's what I want. I want a show where you go episode by episode, but the focus is on morals, meanings, messages, the heart of the show. Why is it that people have been coming up to me since I was little and saying your father's show changed my life? So if it did in fact do that, how did it change them and what are they getting out of it?
Yeah.
So that's the premise. And none of us realized at the time, like, oh, okay, well, if you start this now in 2012, it'll take you until about 2027 to get through the first part of it, which is all the Trek that existed at the time we started the show.
Hey, you have a job until at least 2027.
I do. And there's just more coming because they keep making more Star Trek, which is great.
Yes.
And I love that all these new shows have their own angles and their own intended audiences and their own spin. And I can't wait for more.
Well, I think that's where you and I met, because you were working for Creation at the time, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So my show in Chicago had partnered with Creation. I had gone out there to film stuff on my own for the shows that I was producing. And then they said, hey, what about the next time you do this? You come out and we partner. So you get video, we get video, you get access. And that worked out quite well. We did that for a number of years. And it was also around that time, there was a lot happening at the experience vis-a-vis the convention,
yes,
which then ultimately with the experience closing, it was like a last hurrah, like, oh, okay, well, let's shoot everything we possibly can, but yeah, and that's exactly it. Creation had said, go shoot all this stuff. And gosh, you and Michael and Vernon and Chad and just so many people there were very welcoming and interested in what we were doing. And I having come from a themed entertainment background myself, I was fascinated with what you were doing. So,
well,
yeah, I couldn't get enough of it.
Yeah, we were.
Yeah. Oh,
that's
truly.
Still are, and you are a part of that family.
Oh.
So.
Well, I love and respect all you guys, and it was to use a Star Trek phrase, the best of both worlds. Being a fan of Star Trek, but then also having worked in entertainment and worked in theme entertainment and grown up being an actor, I stepped into that and I was like, okay, first of all, this is fulfilling all the fantasy of Star Trek. But second of all, this is the kind of production that I can really get into. Yeah. And I loved every detail and certainly your and everybody else's dedication to character and you never breaking character until the very end. but that whole show, like it was very hard for me to express to people who didn't get it why that was so important. Yeah. And again, for many reasons, but Yeah, I always speak lovingly of Star Trek: The Experience, and partly because of the friends that I've made, and partly because it was just an epic, well-produced show.
Yes, yeah, there will never be its like. I really don't think they can ever. They certainly can't reproduce it, but even to do something similar,
Right.
I mean, Rise of the Resistance is probably the closest thing out there.
Yeah, and I mean, well, so you and I are both Disneyland fans as well, and I think for a lot of the same reasons, which is, we want to be immersed in the environment and sort of live that fantasy, but we also see the show aspect of it, like, ooh, what are they doing to bring this show to life? And you go to Galaxy's Edge, it is phenomenal. It is beautifully designed. You absolutely feel like you're in that world. The difference, though, the thing that they're missing is they don't have that long-form character interaction that Star Trek: The Experience had.
I think they wanted to.
They did.
They wanted to, but for some reason, it just didn't play out the way they wanted it to.
Right.
So,
I hope that comes.
That would be nice.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was just what a great little conversation we had there. I do want to move it, though, to the topic of what we're talking about today, which is how Kirk, Spock, and McCoy epitomize the Aristotelian proofs of ethos, logos, and pathos. And I have to tell you, one of the reasons you're on is because I swear I first heard this from you. And I think it was because, were you wearing a shirt, a T-shirt or something?
Yes. We did indeed have T-shirts that were the silhouettes of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy on the transporter pad with the ethos, pathos, logos names by them. Yeah.
And can you still get those T-shirts? Because I think we need some.
Believe me, we do need them. And you can't right now. So as Mission Log has evolved, as Roddenberry Entertainment has evolved, and various hands in the pie of merchandise, we had to kind of take everything away. But then we're slowly putting things back. So I wouldn't give up just yet. I think those will be back one day. But I have to tell you, there's the background of this is that doing Mission Log and examining stories that have a moral point of view and moral decisions made by our characters, we had first started looking at it as something that I think a lot of people have heard before, which was the Freudian concept of id, ego, superego.
I've heard that as well, yeah.
And it fits very nicely. It really does. And it's not to say that any of this that we're discussing was, some writer at Star Trek in 1966 said, oh, wait, I know how to write these characters. No. This is what we bring to it after the fact. Right. But we got an email very early on, probably the first episode where we had played with that idea. Somebody saying, hey, did you ever think about this? What about the Aristotelian persuasions of ethos, pathos, logos? Go with it. And we did.
Yeah, it's brilliant. I swear my head exploded when I saw that T-shirt. I was like, I need to teach this to my students. It makes perfect sense.
Right.
Yeah, it's part of, rhetoric. Rhetoric is the art of persuasion, and this is the outgrowth of that art. These are the things that you have to do. So,
well, I think what's interesting for the point of our conversation is that, none of these characters are always exactly the same thing. No. Even with Spock, if you just nail Spock and say, oh, okay, he's logos all the time, well, not exactly, though. And
as a former Vulcan, I'm
right.
very well aware that Vulcans are not devoid of emotion and are only logical.
Seething with it, yes.
Seething with it. Well, we sublimate it, okay?
Yes.
Pushing it down.
Yeah. And the other part of it, so that they're not always all one thing. And we're not always necessarily talking about the sort of arguments that they're having externally with each other. We're also just talking about kind of the motivations that they bring to their position. So it's not just, you get Kirk, Spock, McCoy in the boardroom arguing a point. What do we do about this? Yeah, because they all will express different aspects. McCoy has to have a scientific mind as well.
Sure.
Because he's the doctor, of course he does.
Yes.
But what you see is you sort of look at how the characters got to where they are and why they're reacting in the moment about something. And then you can say like, oh, okay, yeah, there's Spock doing his logical thing again.
Right.
There's McCoy being so worked up, he can hardly contain himself, So yeah, we're playing fast and loose with the idea, but generally speaking, you can kind of nail these guys with these terms. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I teach my students about ethos is that there are 4 aspects to it. There's credibility, character, competence, and charisma.
Oh.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
Kirk is certainly credible. I mean, if he says he's going to do something, you better believe he's going to do it,
Right.
He's got character. He's a generally good person, somewhat imperfect, but you don't have to be perfect to be of good character.
And he's lousy with charisma.
Lousy with charisma. He does get the girl quite a bit. Yes. Yes. But on top of that, he also inspires other people to do their best. So that's a charismatic person who has character.
Right.
Can inspire other people to live up to their own potential, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he has all those qualities of command, and that's a really important part of it that you just explained very well, which is that, sure, you can have somebody who's done all the homework to land at that higher position, but they're sort of useless if they can't inspire the people who work for them to actually go do the work.
Right. You can
do it well.
You can be competent and very boring,
Yes. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So, and the same can be said for the others as well. That same thing can be said for Spock and can be said for McCoy. They've earned their positions because of their competence. They can inspire the best work out of the people around them because of their character and charisma. There are all these other aspects to them, and we see it over and over in the shows. Sometimes, again, it's just because the convenience of who is the character who is there that needs to deliver that particular line.
Yeah.
But it also fleshes out these characters to give them more than one facet.
Of course. I mean, any good narrative, has all these things interwoven, and the characters, epitomize that as well. So in terms of leadership ability, well, what do you think of Kirk as a leader? Like, who would you compare him to if you could compare him to someone?
So I don't want to be too obvious, but Gene Roddenberry had a deep love of Abraham Lincoln. He also had a deep love for John F. Kennedy. And Star Trek came out at exactly the right time, which was, sadly, is after the Kennedy assassination, but it's right as the U.S. space program is ramping up. And Star Trek even sort of predicted it in its way when the first moon landing would be. They were close about that Apollo mission,
Yeah.
And there is something, there is definitely a good deal of truth to that, to say that here's this young, good-looking guy who's the president who can get up and give the speech to say, we will do these things because they are hard. And by the way, one of these things we're going to do is go to the moon. And I'm going to set a goal, and it may sound crazy, it may sound difficult, but we can actually do it. And by God, they actually did, and on schedule, within that time frame of before the end of the decade of the 1960s. So I think that's a very clear sort of pattern for Kirk. And I think it's, again, partly not because somebody sat down and said, oh, we have to exactly spell out these qualities. I think it's because that was the feeling of the time. That was, he was this popular person who had all this energy, captured the imagination and interest of the public. And then when he's taken away, becomes a bit, aggrandized.
A mythical character, almost, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So all these good and even better qualities get thrown at him. But the reality is, that legacy, particularly with the space program, really stuck. So I Star Trek was sort of the perfect parallel to that real world event as well.
Wow. I love that comparison with Kennedy. I never thought of it, but it makes perfect sense. So let's move on to Spock. We did kind of touch on Spock a little bit. Obviously, connection to Logos and the idea that Vulcans aren't totally devoid of logic, but it's their ideal. Like the ideal Vulcan would be one that's purged all their emotions in the ritual of Kolinar.
Right.
But how many Vulcans actually achieve that? Not very many.
Right.
So, and Spock had to try even harder than your basic Vulcan because he had a human mother. So I have to tell you that I see him as the representation of how hard it is to be logical.
Yeah.
Just, on a daily basis. But how necessary it is, because when you need Spock, you really need Spock. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, that's such a great way of putting it, because when we look at any of the alien species in Star Trek, we're looking at us. There are no Vulcans, there are no Klingons, there are no Romulans. There's only us so far. As far as we know, there's only humans. Right. We hope I live to see the day that's proven wrong. But what we're doing is we're exploring these aspects of the human journey and the human psyche. And I think by having a character like Spock, you're really making that point, which is to say, okay, we benefit enormously from stepping away from volatile emotional problems and actually absorbing the logic of it, trying to make a logical decision about the best way to go here. But if you do that too much, you actually then lose sight of maybe the stakes of that problem. And you see this a lot in the Spock McCoy interactions, where it'll be like, I want to say it's balance of terror. Spock is just rattling off numbers, just like, well, if we do this many people will die, and the odds are that this many people will die. And he's purely looking at it as a mathematical problem. But then you have to have McCoy just come in and go, my God, you're talking about deaths of millions of people. Regardless, it doesn't matter, good decision, bad decision. For McCoy, it's just like, no, we have to look at the emotional impact here of what will actually happen. And Spock is such a great example specifically of how to merge that emotional and logical side. When you get to Star Trek, the motion picture, he has to have his moment with V'ger, when then suddenly, you just mentioned Kolinar, and for our audience who doesn't know the ins and outs of Vulcan mythology, and the idea that you could actually purge every last emotion, or maybe we say emotional response, from yourself, and that is an idealized way to live. Well, at the beginning of Star Trek, the motion picture, he does that. Tries to, but it's not quite right. You zoom halfway through the picture and he goes off to mind meld with this alien entity, V'ger, and he comes back and he holds Captain Kirk's hand and he said, and talking about their friendship, and he says, this simple feeling is beyond V'ger's comprehension. And that moment to me sort of says everything that needs to be said about Spock's journey, that you can do as much as you possibly can to fetishize logic, but it has no meaning, it has no value if you don't have a human connection, if you don't have some sort of acceptance of your emotional side. And then that leads us very nicely in Star Trek II. By the way, spoiler for anybody who hasn't seen it.
Spock's 40 years old, but whatever.
Right. But Spock's sacrifice in Star Trek II. And I think it's such a great moment. I mean, it still makes me tear up, even though I've seen it a million times, but it's perfect for that character because it is a logical choice that he makes. It is a logical course of action that he takes to save everybody else in the Enterprise by sacrificing himself. It is also the ultimately human emotional choice to make.
Yes, you made that logical choice out of love.
Yeah. So, I get teary thinking about it now.
Yeah, absolutely. Which leads us to McCoy.
Irascible McCoy.
Yeah. Like I said, when I was looking at this, it was a little difficult for me to think of McCoy as the epitome of pathos, unless pathos means cranky, because he's a pretty cranky guy. I mean, don't get me wrong; it's got some great lines.
Sure.
Which pathos, a part of using emotion to persuade other people, is through figures of speech, which, he's got them till the cows come home. There's
yes.
But, the whole, I'm a doctor, not a fill in the blank space,
Not a bricklayer. Yeah.
He certainly says those with the same cranky gusto, but figures of speech like anecdotes and metaphors and, just great emotionally laden language, space.
Yeah.
Disease danger wrapped in darkness and silence.
And doesn't that tell you everything about, the Kirk, Spock, McCoy dynamic? Like for Spock, it's logical that this is his job. This is what I'll do. I'll go to the Enterprise, I'll do my job, and I'll do it well. For Kirk, the opportunity of command, the opportunity of adventure, kind of showing off his skills, that's the appeal. For McCoy, it's like, I really don't want to be here, but I have problems with the ex-wife, and space is probably going to kill us. Like, that is the emotional feeling that I relate to, right there. But I mentioned it before, like in Balance of Terror, where McCoy is just worked up about the cost of lives. For Kirk, it's a command decision. How do I make the best decision to protect my crew and to be strategically valid? For Spock, it's a logical question of how many people die if we do this? How many people die if we do this? For McCoy, both of those go out the window. People are going to die. I can't sit by and not say anything if people are going to die. And then I would also say, probably the most popular, and for anybody who's listening to this who is not a Star Trek fan or who is not not sort of deeply steeped in Star Trek, probably all of you will know and love City on the Edge of Forever. And if you haven't watched it, go watch it. Even if you're not a Trek fan, even if you know nothing about Trek, it's such a great standalone episode on its own. And I'm about to spoil that as well. Here's ethos, pathos, logos in action, because you've got Spock logically deciding what needs to happen to set time on its preferred normal, quote unquote, normal course. You've got Kirk, who is in command of the situation. He has to make decisions based on the information that Spock has brought him and how he'll protect his crew who are around him and get back to where they belong. And then you've got McCoy, who at the beginning of the episode is literally just lashing out emotionally because he's on something. But at the end of the episode, what does he do? He sees what's about to happen to Edith Keeler and just jumps into action to rush out and save her until Kirk can grab him and bring him back in. So Kirk had to make the command decision about what to do, but McCoy, rightfully so, was acting purely on emotional instinct.
Right.
Somebody's about to get hurt, I have to go help them. He was wrong, but he was also right.
Everybody was right.
Yeah.
Very sadly. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And if we think about Star Trek V, the much maligned The Final Frontier, which is truly not a great movie, but it is good Star Trek.
It'd be a great episode. It's one of those movies that would have made a great episode.
Yeah, right, yeah. And you've got, again, the triumvirate acting in this way, where Spock's curiosity at first about Sybok and about his plan and his claims, he's approaching it from a logical point of view. Oh, okay. Well, we need to find out what's going on here. We need to see if he's actually what he says he is. And, well, he's not wrong about some things, so I guess we'll follow this to its logical conclusion. And you've got McCoy, who truly is emotionally compromised in this movie in a profound way when he has his encounter with Sybok, which changes his course of action in the movie. But then you got Kirk, command charismatic Kirk, coming in at the end and uttering the ultimate line, what does God need with a starship? He's so in command and confident that he would call out the all-powerful alien entity to say, no, wait, you think you're in command? I'm in command. That's my ship. You can't take it.
Awesome. Yeah, I was looking up these quotes by McCoy, to try and find these things that really, really epitomize pathos and Requiem for Methuselah.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, at the very
Raina.
end. And yes. And I'd probably describe this poorly, but Raina is, what is she, an AI? She's like
she's an android, but brilliantly executed,
who happens to care very deeply for her creator. And of course, Kirk, who wanders in all hot and charismatic,
Right.
And basically, she can't deal with the emotion of, having loving these two very different people, and it destroys her. She can't survive, which Kirk is pretty much devastated as well.
Right.
And McCoy says to Spock, he still sees Spock as this just purely logical person at this point. And this is the greatest quote about love ever. He says, you see, I feel sorrier for you than I do for him, because you'll never know the things that love can drive a man to. The ecstasies, the miseries, the broken rules, the desperate chances, the glorious failures, and the glorious victories. All of these things you'll never know, simply because the word love isn't written in your book.
Whoa.
I know that lays me out every time.
Yeah. That's so good.
But what does Spock do after that? He walks up to Kirk is sleeping and he puts his hand on his head and he says, forget.
Right. Yeah.
That's the only thing he can think of to do, is to take that pain away from him, which is a very emotional thing to do.
Interesting parallel then to Star Trek II, putting his hand on McCoy and saying, remember,
yes.
Yeah. That's it. Yeah, McCoy leads with his heart. And I even think it's not a favorite episode of mine, The Empath, but I want to say that the connection that is forged is because of McCoy with the woman who is sort of the alien bait, I guess, for lack of a better word. He has this place where he comes with all this baggage, which is awesome. The more you get into the character, the more you find out he had a daughter, and his wife had called it off with him. And when we come around to rejoining McCoy in the motion picture, he's got the long beard and the disco medallions, and he's just, all he wanted to do was stay home and drink a mint julep, but they drafted him. And we get those moments from our other characters, not those specifically, but we get emotional moments from the other characters. But if anybody's going to wear it on a sleeve, it is purely McCoy.
That is true. So this whole Trek triumvirate, I don't know if that's what they're called, but that's what I'm calling them.
Yeah, it works.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, as you said, at the very beginning, you have to use all of these things. They're all important. Think of people who have charisma but no logic. I think we can think of some people that
I don't know. I would dig through history.
Yeah, have a certain charisma, not to me, but to a lot of other people. But no logic whatsoever. But they can still be extremely persuasive. Extremely.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily a good thing. Or logic with no emotion.
Right. And I think that's a big one. And honestly, I think that is a theme that plays itself out in not just in these characters, but in Star Trek writ large and in science fiction. Go back to Fritz Lang's Metropolis, and the conversation there was that the head and the heart, or the head and the hands, need a mediator, which is the heart. And Star Trek has this sort of, sometimes a difficult relationship with technology, but it's always coming back to the idea that all of these things that we have, scientific advances, the adventures that we get to have, like, none of it is worthwhile unless we understand basic human things like compassion. And Spock specifically has to grow into that lesson. Yeah. What's nice is you can go back and you can rewatch and you're like, was that a moment that Spock was expressing emotion, but he didn't want to let on that he was? Yes, I think it was. So, but he, Spock had to take 20 years to learn that lesson. Well, not quite 20 years, 15 years watching Star Trek in real time to come around to that understanding. And it makes him a better person for it.
So I truly believe that that's one of the reasons that Star Trek has just persevered for over 50 years as a franchise, just because of that. I mean, obviously, it's branched out into other characters and other narratives, but that is the heart of it. I think that triumvirate and how they just epitomize the things that are necessary to make a difference in the world,
Yeah, I think it's a little disingenuous to say, like, well, I'm going to sit down and watch Star Trek for a moral message. No, I don't think that's how people start out. I don't think that's, I think that you're given the promise of an interesting, thought-provoking drama with good characters that you can get behind. And the sort of inherent understanding that you have when you're faced with a dilemma and you have these three people, and we're just talking about the three today, but obviously there are much more in the original Star Trek, and there are many more in Star Trek as it grew out and grew into a franchise. Sure. But we're just talking about these three today. I think there's something inherent about looking at a problem that they face and say, oh, wait, maybe all of these angles, maybe all of these sides do have validity. They all have, like, Spock, McCoy, and Kirk are all smart. Their hearts are all in the right place. But we actually have to talk out the problem to figure out the best solution. Right. Even if the best solution might be the most difficult one, it might be for any number of reasons. It might be the most time-consuming, the most taxing, the most, not the most resource-friendly. But we have to come to what is the best solution here. And ultimately, Star Trek is very aspirational in that sense, that it says to the people who are watching it, look what happens if you actually act on those impulses to be better. Look what happens when you actually try to size up a problem and try to take all of these things into account, all of these angles of this problem into account. Look how good we can land on the other side of it.
Well, John Champion.
April Hebert.
That was brilliant. What a great way to end this interview. I want to thank you again, taking some time out of your very busy schedule. I know you're very busy.
Well, and I know you are too, and I thank you so much. I mean, this is such a pleasure for me. Because week after week, I'm looking at an individual episode of Star Trek, and that's a lot of fun. It's also a lot of work. But I love going back and looking at, okay, what is the big picture here? What are the important ideas here? And you have certainly nailed one of them.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, it was so much fun to get all nerdy and philosophical with my friend John Champion. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I really don't have much to add to what he said. I mean, in order to be the best, most effective persuader while still being an ethical one, we really do need to use all of Aristotle's proofs of persuasion. And the Trek triumvirate has some really good examples of that. To use logic with no emotion isn't very persuasive. That's why few people are swayed by the facts. Unfortunately, tactics like using emotion with no logic, or being very charismatic while also being inconsistent and illogical, can be extremely persuasive, even though they're ultimately unethical. As a good critical thinker, we need to be on the lookout for those tactics, and maybe take a few lessons from Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. Check out the show notes for a list of all the Star Trek episodes and movies that we referenced, along with some other interesting resources if you're curious about this Trek-Aristotle connection. There's also a link to the Mission Log archive in case you want to listen to specific episodes of that podcast. And of course, you can find Mission Log on Apple Podcasts or your favorite platform. That's it for now. I hope you use the information in this episode to help you think it through.